Spurs have finally won a trophy.
Well, you can tell everybody. Yeah, you can tell everybody.
Top Spur? No. What's that?
And what better way to celebrate than to make an edit of the GOAT, Heung-min Son.
In New York, I merely rock, hiding in my socks.
But unlike the other edits on this channel, we are not going to be doing this alone. We have a collab with the boy Aerographics, and he sent me over this PSD, and we're going to see what he's cooked up first of all, and then we're going to do our part, is what I would have said. Except, in my opinion, the content in the video wasn't enough to make it into a full-on process video. So I thought, why not just launch it into my new series, which I'm going to be calling Design Dissection, which is basically just a fancier way of saying layer breakdown, but you get the point. So for context, this is what Aero sent me, and I saw the potential straight away. All these orange tones, the nice night sky, the contrast between the blue and the orange, the composition, all these background elements, these houses, everything was there for a really good edit. And so I turned it into this. But how exactly did we go from this, absolutely nothing, to this, and then finally to this? Well, let's dissect it. So I'm going to start with the two images of Son, because whenever you're making an edit, you should figure out the composition of your player images first and then build the background around it. Which I don't know if that's what Aero did, because he started it, but that's what I would have done. So first we started with this, darkened it a bit and brightened it in some areas like here. Then added this sort of oriental East Asian house, blended in the trees more into here, and then here comes the night sky, because obviously the setting was going to be nighttime. I put in a nice starry night sky, a hue saturation layer to remove all of the color from it, curves to make these areas darker, a color lookup to basically color grade the entire scene into that nighttime feel that we wanted, color balance to accentuate it, and then hue saturation layers on the building, because eventually the windows of these buildings were made to glow. So here we fill them in with orange and then put some more glows on top of it.
We? Who's we? There is no we.
Made it yellow. There's some more glows on the overlay blend mode, and then a final glow on top of that to accentuate it again. Then comes the Spurs logo, where we put the two Spurs badges in here with some blend if to make some of these branches and the texture come back through so it's not as flat. Then a copy of this on top with some Gaussian blur to accentuate the light and make this into a light source rather than just the badge. More glows on top of that, a layer painted with some orange set to overlay. Now the background was done, and in the foreground we have more of these houses, which a camera raw filter was put onto them to reduce the blue tones that were in the original image. The same color lookup to bring the night sort of tones and color grading to the house. Color balance to bring some yellow to the edges, which is where most of the orange light is going to be hitting. Curves to make this darker. Hue saturation layers to bring the highlights back. And then curves to accentuate the highlights. Yet another house image was added here with the same camera raw filter to filter out all of the blue tones. And essentially the same process again, color lookups, making it darker, adding some color balance, and then some highlights. And then the ground image was added. The original ground image looks something like this. So I just made sure to erase the parts that we didn't need and tried to blend it in with the atmosphere that's already going on. A layer with exposure down to match the midtones of the ground to the midtones with the rest of the image. Some more exposure to bring some shadows to these rocks that are already on the side. Try and make them more blended with the rest of the scene. Color balance to match the color to the night environment that's sort of going on. Curves to darken it further, a bit of color balance to further accentuate the blues, and a hue saturation layer to add some highlights to the ground, because all of this orange lighting would of course be reflected onto the ground here. And using generative fill, I filled in this bottom part and extended the ground to the rest of the canvas. Then for the piece of land in the foreground, I added a camera raw filter to get rid of the orange tones from the original image, and some field blur to blur it, because of course it's in the foreground. It's not going to be as in focus as the other parts of the image. Hue saturation layer to make it black and white, exposure to match the midtones, color balance to match the colors, curves to further darken it, color balance to accentuate the color grading, and then hue saturation to bring some of those highlights back into the foreground. So as you can see, when it comes to blending, a lot of the stuff is very similar. All you really need to do is you need to match the values, aka the lightness and the darkness of the image, and what's going on in the background. You need to match the color, and you need to account for any light sources. If you can do all of those well, then the image you'll produce is going to be cohesive and it's going to work. In between all these layers, there's just a lot more glows coming from behind everywhere and filling in these sorts of spaces behind the houses, like this, and a few more. Some of them are set to different blend modes. For example, this one is overlay, which makes it look less flat, and then a layer on screen to sort of brighten the glow a bit more. Next, we'll move on to some of the other elements that I added. So first, coming from these buildings, I added these lanterns that are kind of hanging down with a rope. I don't have the layers for these, but essentially I took a standing lantern, took the bottom part off, filled in the middle windows with an orange layer, and then a orange layer set to the linear dodge add blend mode to paint this sort of glow that's going on here. Hue saturation layers to paint the glow onto these surrounding areas because they will be hit by the light, and also hue saturation layer to paint on the outside because all of this orange light that's going on will also be reflected onto the lantern. And I just warped it to match the perspective of the buildings that's already here going on, and took a rope image and blended that in using the same procedure, and we ended up with 3 of them here, here, and also on this building here. Next, I added these flying lanterns where I used exposure to brighten them up and then color fill to again make them glow. Flying lanterns are actually a Chinese thing, and of course Son is Korean, so honestly I just thought they'd look cool and they'd fill up this sky area fairly nicely. Does this count as cultural appropriation? Am I gonna get cancelled 3 videos in? Anyway, with the same process I added some more. I erased this big one from here and rotated it so it doesn't look too samey, and then one in the background all the way back here just for some detail. Next, I added this little pillar thing. I don't really know what this is, but it's something. First, I made a shadow for it by duplicating it, making it black, changing the blend mode to soft light, and then fading it out as you would see in a shadow, and then another shadow on the bottom for where it touches the ground. And for blending, basically the same process as the ground, matching colors, lighting, and then adding highlights like so. I also duplicated this and added one in the foreground to fill up some of this foreground space because I didn't really know what to put here, in all honesty. So I kind of just thought, yeah, we'll put it here, why not? Then I wanted to add some haze to the foreground because I felt like we needed some separation from the foreground and the background. So I added some dark blue haze in front of this thing, but also behind Son, just to make it seem a bit further away. And then some orange haze in this area, just to do the same thing really. Then I added this Korean text, which literally just reads Son Heung-min in Korean. Put the fill to 0, put a stroke on it so that only the outline would show, and then put it onto soft light blend mode so it blends in with the background but doesn't stand out too much, and then just faded it out towards the bottom. Next is the main part of the edit, which is my favorite part of the edit, and it's always render work. So that includes player image treatment, blending them into the background, and then doing highlights. So for the big image of Son, first there was a camera raw filter that went into it, basically just desaturating him a bit. Then a layer of curves set to multiply and a layer of curves set to screen to accentuate those shadows and highlights. Selective color to change some colors. Did he even change anything? Did he do anything? There's nothing here. Oh, he changed the whites. Selective color to increase the highlights a bit more, and then an exposure layer to match the values of Son to the values of the background and everything else going on. Color balance to match Son to the rest of the background, so the night sky and that sort of blue tone. And then a layer with exposure down to paint some shadows. Our first layer of hue saturation to paint the initial highlight here, which covers most of it, and then another hue saturation layer to accentuate the highlights in some of these darker areas, so for example the sleeves here. And finally another hue saturation layer where I painted hair on top of Son, which basically just makes it look more natural and accentuates that. Now for the smaller image of Son, again we started out with a camera raw filter, then a bit of darkening of the feet, then again the same curve set to multiply, curve set to screen to accentuate the shadows and highlights. The same process again, matching the midtones, matching the color, painting shadows. But in this case we also needed a floor shadow. So for that, Aero already painted this shadow. And then I duplicated Son, flipped him around, and did the same process as this shadow to make a shadow here, which adds a touch more realism than just having, you know, standard floor shadows, because it of course replicates how a real life shadow would be. And then the final step for Son here, as usual, would be highlights. So then the first layer of highlights goes in, and the second layer to accentuate those darker areas, and then some painting over the hair here. Once I had all this going on, it was time to add some finishing touches. So I added some glows by taking an orange color fill layer, setting it to linear dodge add blend mode, and then just painting some on wherever I see fit. Especially in these kind of edits, where there's very prominent light sources, you need a good amount of glows. They just add so much atmosphere and they add so much more depth to those light sources. Like for example, here's the edit without glows. Without any glows at all. It just doesn't give off the same vibe. And here it is with glows. Then I added some outer glows to the edges of Son, both the big Son and the small Son. A gradient map to accentuate the yellow parts. And then a color fill layer set to soft light, where I just painted on a slight vignette around the edges with this dark blue tone. And then a few color lookups, and then a camera raw, filter, as well as some radial blur, where I essentially just blurred the edges here. Brings the focus more towards the main middle part of the image. I still wasn't happy with the camera raw filter after this, so I made some adjustments manually. I used curves to darken the foreground areas a bit, exposure to darken the back of this lantern here, since it would be darker considering it's further away from the main scene and everything else that's going on, and it's in the foreground. Some curves just to bring up the shadows, as opposed to what I was doing earlier for some odd reason, because I felt like it was too much. And decreasing the saturation of the ground a bit, because I felt the blue tone here was a bit too saturated and too aggressive. So I just softened that a bit in comparison to the rest of the image. And then a bit of RGB, chromatic aberration, to create this effect. Finally, mine and Aero's logos, and that's it. So yeah, especially for this kind of edit, there is a lot going on. But by making sure the images that you pick all go with each other and they fit the composition, and you build the background around this composition that you envision, it makes the process a lot smoother, a lot easier, and it often ends up being a better edit. In this case, this collab is one of my favorite edits that I've made recently. I'm very happy with the way it turned out. Anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy this kind of video. It wasn't as in-depth as the ones where I take you through the process, but because there wasn't too much to do, I thought I'd just break down the layers and dissect it instead. Again, huge shout out to Aero Graphics. This wouldn't be possible without his initial composition and his initial ideas. So as I said, I hope you did enjoy this video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all of that. And I'll see you in the next one.